Hello?
Mr. Calloway, this is Priya, calling from Bright Meadows. Your mother was found on the floor of her room about 40 minutes ago. She's stable now, but I need to ask you something important.
Is she okay? Why hasn't my brother called me back?
Sir, there's a note on her file, right next to your name. It says, "Do not contact unless necessary."
That was 2 weeks before a charity gala neither Danny nor anyone else in his family could yet imagine. Somebody had written 5 words next to his own name on his own mother's file, and he hadn't been the one to write them. Before I tell you what those words actually cost this family, if you love stories where a quiet man stops accepting a lie he's been fed for years, hit subscribe, because the reckoning at the end of this one happens in front of 300 people who had no idea what they were about to witness. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, back to the story. Danny sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long moment after the call ended, feeling something crack open in his chest that he'd spent 3 years welding shut. Do not contact unless necessary. He said the words out loud to the empty room, like saying them again might make them make sense. Danny was 54 years old, ran a small HVAC repair business out of a converted garage 2 towns over from where he'd grown up, and had spent the better part of 3 years believing his mother simply didn't want him in her life anymore. That belief had cost him more than he ever let himself say out loud. It had cost him holidays he spent alone, a version of himself that had gone quiet and guarded in ways his ex-wife eventually got tired of living around, and a low, constant ache he'd learned to carry the way you learn to carry any chronic pain, by simply not talking about it. The story he'd been told by his older brother Preston was that their mother's early memory decline had made her anxious and confused around Danny specifically. Something about an old disagreement from years back that had apparently never fully healed in her mind, and that visits from him only agitated her. Preston had said it gently, the first time, sitting across from Danny at a diner 2 towns over. "She just needs calm right now, Danny. Give her some space. I'll keep you updated." The old disagreement Preston referenced had been real enough on its own. 3 years back, over a loan Danny had asked their mother for when his business nearly folded during a slow winter, a loan she'd given without hesitation and Preston had quietly disapproved of, muttering something at the time about enabling and boundaries that Danny had brushed off as typical older brother posturing. It had been a small friction, the kind every family absorbs and moves past within a season. But Preston, Danny would only understand much later, had taken that small friction and used it as the seed for something much larger, a story he could tell their mother in her more confused moments about Danny's supposed resentment, about tension that needed managing, planting doubts gently enough that she couldn't always tell afterward whether the worry had been hers originally or handed to her. The updates had come less and less often after that, until they simply stopped, and Danny, exhausted and guilty, and unsure whether his own presence really was doing harm to a woman whose mind he could no longer fully trust to represent her own wishes, had let the distance settle into something he told himself was respect, rather than what it actually was, which was absence. He filled the space where his mother used to be with work, with long hours under other people's houses fixing furnaces that weren't his to fix, and with a version of Sunday phone calls to Preston that had become so brief and so carefully managed that Danny stopped expecting anything from them. Beyond a status update, he had no way to verify. "She's stable. She's comfortable. She's not up for visitors this week." 3 years of that, delivered in the same, even reasonable tone every single time, had worn a groove in Danny's mind deep enough that he'd stopped even noticing how strange it was that his own mother's voice had disappeared so completely from his life. He drove to the facility that night without bothering to change out of the sweatpants he'd been sleeping in, doing 80 on empty back roads with his hands locked at 10 and 2, replaying every version of the last 3 years and trying to figure out where exactly he'd stopped asking the questions he should have kept asking. If you'd been told for 3 years that your own mother didn't want you near her, would you have kept pushing anyway? Or would you have done what Danny did and stepped back to give her the peace everyone told you she needed? Tell me honestly in the comments, because what Danny found when he walked through those doors that night would make him wish, more than almost anything else in his life, that he'd pushed harder a long time ago. The facility itself looked fine from the outside, a mid-tier assisted living complex with a manicured entrance and a name in tasteful brass lettering, the kind of place that photographs well for a brochure. But the room they led him to told a different story entirely. His mother lay in a bed that hadn't been properly changed, an IV line taped clumsily to the back of one thin hand, her hair matted flat against her skull in a way that spoke of weeks rather than hours of neglect. She looked smaller than he remembered, folded into herself, and for a moment, watching her chest rise and fall unevenly under a thin blanket, Danny forgot every ounce of the anger he'd built up walking in and felt only the old, simple fear of a son who might be about to lose his mother. She woke briefly around 4 in the morning, her eyes finding his face in the dim light with a confusion that slowly, painfully, resolved into recognition. "Danny," she said, her voice cracked and papery. "My Danny, where have you been?" He took her hand, careful of the IV line, and told her he was right there, he wasn't going anywhere, and she gripped his fingers with a strength that surprised him for someone who looked so frail. "They told me you didn't want to come anymore," she whispered. "I told them that wasn't true. I told them to call you." Danny sat very still, turning that sentence over in his mind, because it directly contradicted everything Preston had told him for 3 straight years, and one of those 2 versions of the truth was about to fall apart completely. She drifted in and out over the following hour, sometimes present enough to ask about his business, whether he was eating well, whether he'd found someone since the divorce, and other times slipping into a confusion that had her asking where her own mother was, decades gone, or worrying aloud about a school bus schedule for children who were themselves now well into middle age. Danny sat through all of it, holding her hand through the parts that made sense and the parts that didn't, understanding for the first time just how much of a mind can blur at the edges, while the core of a person, the part that loved and worried and reached for the people who mattered, stayed entirely intact underneath. The next morning, once his mother had been stabilized and moved to a private room for observation, Danny found Priya at the nurse's station and asked her, as calmly as he could manage, how long his mother had been in the condition he'd found her in. Priya glanced around before answering, the way people do when they're about to say something they probably shouldn't. She told him the facility had been operating his mother's account on a reduced care tier for the past 8 months, the kind of tier reserved for families who'd stopped keeping up with the higher level payment plan, despite Eleanor's files showing an estate more than substantial enough to afford full private care indefinitely. She told him visits from anyone besides a man named Preston Calloway had essentially stopped entirely over that same period, and that Eleanor had, in her professional opinion, seemed to decline faster once those visits dried up, the way people sometimes do when the will to engage starts slipping away, along with the company that used to sustain it. Priya hesitated before adding one more detail, the kind of thing she admitted she wasn't strictly supposed to volunteer, but felt Danny deserved to hear anyway. She said that on more than one occasion over recent months, Eleanor had specifically asked staff, during her clearer stretches, to call a son named Danny, and that those requests had been logged in her chart but never acted upon, because the file listed Preston as sole point of contact and the facility's policy required going through him first for any changes to visitation. Somebody, somewhere in that chain, had simply decided those requests didn't need to go anywhere further, and Priya said, quietly, that it was the kind of thing that happened more often than anyone in her line of work liked to admit. Families with a controlling point of contact quietly steering an elderly resident's own stated wishes into a drawer nobody opened. Danny left that conversation with his hands shaking, not entirely from anger yet, more from the sensation of watching a floor he'd been standing on for 3 years quietly reveal itself to have never really been there at all. He drove home in daylight this time, and instead of going back to work, he sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing down every date, every conversation, every excuse Preston had ever given him, trying to build a timeline out of memory alone, because he was starting to suspect that timeline was the only honest record left. If you found out the reason you'd stayed away from someone you loved for 3 years wasn't the reason you'd actually been given, how far would you go to find out the truth, even knowing what it might cost you with the rest of your family? Let me know below, because Danny was about to find out exactly how far he was willing to go, and it started with a phone call to his younger sister. Vicky Calloway Marsh answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular brightness of someone used to smoothing over uncomfortable things for the sake of family peace. When Danny told her what had happened, what he'd found, what Priya had told him about the care tier and the visitor logs, there was a long silence on the other end of the line before Vicky finally said, quietly, that she'd had a feeling something wasn't right for a while now. But Preston had always had an answer ready whenever she asked, and it had always seemed easier to just accept it. "He handles all of Mom's finances, Danny," she said. "He has power of attorney. I don't have access to any of it. I just see him at holidays and he tells me she's doing okay, and I want to believe him because the alternative is exhausting to even think about." That single admission, that Preston held sole power of attorney over their mother's entire estate and had for years controlled every piece of information both siblings received about her condition, sat in Danny's chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading out to touch every version of the last 3 years he thought he understood. He asked Vicky if she'd help him find out what was actually happening with their mother's money, and after a pause long enough that he could hear her breathing on the other end, she said yes, quietly, like a woman finally admitting to herself something she'd known for a long time and simply hadn't wanted to look at directly. Together, they started pulling threads. Vicky, through a cousin who worked in property records, discovered that the family home Danny and Vicky had both grown up in, the one their mother had always sworn she'd keep until she died because it held too many memories to ever sell, had been quietly transferred and sold 11 months earlier. The proceeds moved into an account that neither of them had ever seen mentioned in any conversation with Preston. When Danny asked their mother about the house during a lucid stretch 2 days later, her face crumpled in a way that told him she hadn't known either. "He sold the house," she said, more to herself than to him. "He told me it was for my care. He told me it was the only way to keep me somewhere nice." Danny didn't have the heart to tell her, not yet, that the money from that sale had never actually reached the facility at all, based on the payment records Priya had quietly shown him the week before. Vicky, once she'd fully committed to looking rather than looking away, turned out to be a more thorough investigator than either of them expected. She spent an entire weekend combing through old family emails and a shared cloud folder Preston had set up years earlier, ostensibly for storing their mother's important documents, and found version after version of financial summaries that Preston had circulated to her over the past 2 years, each one showing a steadily depleting but still reasonably healthy account balance that, when Danny cross-referenced the dates against the actual bank statements Carla Fenn later subpoenaed, bore almost no resemblance to the real numbers underneath. Preston had simply been building 2 parallel books, one real and one for his sister's peace of mind, updating the fictional version just often enough and just convincingly enough that Vicky had never had reason to ask for the real thing. The financial picture that slowly assembled itself over the following days was worse than either sibling had let themselves imagine going in. Their mother's modest but genuinely comfortable estate, built over 4 decades of a marriage to their father, and careful, unglamorous saving, had been systematically drawn down through a series of transfers, loans against assets, and payments to accounts registered under a business name Preston controlled. One that did no visible work Danny or Vicky could identify beyond existing as a place for money to sit. The house sale alone should have covered 2 more years of full private care with room to spare. Instead, it had apparently vanished into that same account within weeks of the sale closing, while their mother's actual care had been quietly downgraded to the minimum tier the facility offered, the difference in cost pocketed somewhere. Neither of them could yet prove, but both of them now strongly suspected. Danny hired an elder law attorney the following week, a sharp, unhurried woman named Carla Fenn, who'd built her practice specifically around cases like this one, and who told him within the first hour of their consultation that what he was describing had a name: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and that it happened far more often than most families ever discovered, usually because one sibling controlled access to information and simply told the others whatever kept them from asking further questions. She explained that with power of attorney, Preston had broad legal authority over decisions, but that authority came with a fiduciary duty to act in their mother's best interest. And every piece of what Danny had described so far suggested that duty had been violated repeatedly and knowingly. Carla brought in a forensic accountant named Robert Chu within the first week, a soft-spoken man who worked mostly in silence over a laptop for 3 straight days before presenting Danny and Vicky with a spreadsheet that made the abstract theft suddenly, sickeningly concrete. Robert had traced the house proceeds through 2 intermediate accounts before they landed, largely intact, in an investment account bearing Preston's name alongside a business entity called Meridian Property Holdings, an entity that, on paper, existed to manage rental properties, but that Robert's research showed had never actually held title to any property at all. Alongside the house, money sat 18 months of smaller, recurring transfers, each one modest enough on its own to avoid triggering much scrutiny, but adding up, in total, to a sum that made Vicky put her hand over her mouth when Robert read the final number aloud. This wasn't a single desperate decision made under pressure, Robert told them gently. This was a sustained, carefully paced pattern, built to stay just under the radar for as long as possible. If you discovered that the sibling everyone in your family trusted with the responsible job, the reasonable one, the one who always seemed to have things handled, had actually been the one quietly taking everything apart behind a wall of calm reassurance, would you confront him privately first? Or would you want the rest of the family to see it happen in real time? That question mattered more to Danny than he expected it to, because the opportunity to answer it arrived faster than he was ready for. Preston Calloway had, for the past 6 years, hosted an annual charity gala under the family name, an elegant fundraiser for elder care advocacy that raised genuine money for genuine causes and had, not incidentally, built Preston a sterling reputation among the town's business community as a devoted son, managing his aging mother's care with grace and generosity. The irony of that reputation, once Danny understood what had actually been happening, sat like acid in his stomach every time he thought about it. 3 days before the gala, Preston called Danny directly for the first time in weeks, his voice carrying none of the warmth from their old diner conversations, replaced instead by a brisk, businesslike tone that suggested he'd rehearsed the call more than once before dialing. He suggested they meet, just the two of them, at a coffee shop halfway between their two towns, and Danny, against Carla's explicit advice not to engage privately with Preston outside legal channels, agreed anyway, telling himself he needed to see his brother's face for this particular conversation, rather than hear it secondhand through an attorney. Preston arrived already seated, 2 coffees ordered before Danny even walked in, and opened with an apology so smooth it took Danny a moment to notice it contained no actual admission of anything specific. He talked about stress, about misunderstandings, about how complicated it was, managing an aging parent's finances alone, while everyone else got to simply show up and visit without the burden of spreadsheets and difficult decisions. Danny let him talk for almost 10 minutes before Preston finally arrived at what the meeting had actually been called to accomplish, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table, a proposed settlement drafted by Preston's own lawyer, offering to formally split what remained of their mother's estate 3 ways immediately, in exchange for Danny agreeing not to pursue any further investigation or involve adult protective services beyond whatever had already been filed. Danny looked at that paper for a long moment, thinking about Priya's careful, professional silence, about his mother's hand gripping his in that hospital bed, about the note that had read, "Do not contact unless necessary," sitting beside his own name for reasons he now understood completely. He slid the paper back across the table without opening it further and told Preston, as evenly as he could manage, that this was never about a 3-way split, and that if Preston genuinely believed the only problem here was money he hadn't yet gotten his fair share of, then he understood even less about what he'd done than Danny had originally feared. Preston's face hardened at that, the warmth dropping away entirely, and he said, quieter now, that Danny had no idea how complicated caregiving actually was, how easy it was to sit on the outside and judge decisions he'd never had to make himself. Danny stood up, left cash for both coffees on the table, and told his brother he'd see him at the gala, since Preston clearly wasn't planning on making this easy any other way. Carla Fenn suggested, once she'd gathered enough documented evidence to move forward safely, that the most effective path wasn't necessarily the quietest one. Financial exploitation cases involving powerful, image-conscious perpetrators, she explained, sometimes needed a public reckoning, precisely because private confrontations gave people like Preston room to manage the narrative before authorities or family members could act. Adult Protective Services had already been contacted with the documentation Danny and Vicky assembled. A formal investigation was underway, but the gala, scheduled for the following Saturday, sat right in the middle of that investigation window, and Carla asked Danny directly whether he wanted to wait for the slow machinery of the legal process or whether he wanted the truth to land somewhere. Preston couldn't quietly smooth it over with a phone call and a favor. Danny thought about his mother's hand gripping his in that hospital bed, about Priya's careful, professional silence protecting a truth she wasn't officially allowed to say out loud. About 3 years of a life he'd spent believing he wasn't wanted anywhere near the woman who'd raised him. He decided he wanted the truth to land in front of everyone who'd ever shaken Preston's hand and called him a good son. The gala took place in the grand ballroom of the same hotel it had used for the past 4 years. 300 guests in formal wear beneath crystal chandeliers, a string quartet playing something soft near the entrance, and a step-and-repeat banner reading Callaway Family Foundation for elder dignity that Danny had to stop and read twice before he could make himself walk past it without saying something out loud right there in the lobby. Preston stood near the front of the room in a tailored tuxedo, shaking hands, laughing at exactly the right moments, the picture of a man who had everything under control, and for a moment, watching him work the room with that same easy confidence Danny remembered from childhood, some old, tired part of him wanted to simply turn around and leave rather than blow up whatever piece was left to salvage in this family. But then he thought about the visitor log with his name struck through, the note that said, "Do not contact unless necessary," and he kept walking. Preston's speech was scheduled for 8:30, a brief address before the evening's silent auction closed, and Danny waited until the room had gone quiet, until Preston stood at the small podium at the front, thanking everyone for their generosity toward elder dignity and care. Before he walked forward from the back of the room, Carla Fenn's folder of documents under one arm, and asked, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, whether Preston might want to explain to the room exactly what elder dignity had looked like for their own mother over the past 8 months. The room's murmur died the way a wave pulls back before it breaks. Preston's easy public smile flickered, just barely, the kind of flicker only someone who'd watched that face for 54 years would have caught it all. "Danny," he said, forcing warmth back into his voice, "this isn't the place." Danny set the folder on the small table beside the podium and opened it to the first page. A printed record of the care tier downgrade dated 8 months earlier, Preston's own signature, authorizing the change clearly visible at the bottom. "I think it's exactly the place," Danny said. "Since you built this whole foundation around exactly this issue." Preston tried once more to steer the moment back toward normalcy, gesturing toward the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who'd talked his way out of 100 smaller discomforts before. "Folks, I think my brother's had a difficult few weeks," he said, his voice pitched for sympathy rather than defense. "And I understand emotions are running high, but perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more appropriate." A few guests near the front shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether they were witnessing a family crisis or a misunderstanding, and for one suspended moment, Danny felt the whole room's attention hovering on a knife edge, ready to tip toward Preston's version of events, out of nothing more than social instinct and the desire to avoid an awkward scene. That was when Vicky stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the side of the room, her hands visibly trembling, but her voice steady enough to cut through the murmur. "This isn't emotional, Preston," she said. "I have the account statements. I have Robert Chu's report. I have 8 months of care logs showing Mom was moved to the lowest tier the facility offers, while you were telling me, in writing, that her account balance was healthy and her care was fully funded." She held up her own folder, a mirror of Danny's. "I believed you for 2 years. I'm done believing you tonight." What followed over the next several minutes, in front of 300 guests who had each written checks that evening, specifically to combat the thing Danny was now describing, happening in Preston's own family, was not a shouting match. Danny kept his voice level, almost gentle, laying out the timeline the way Carla had coached him to. The house sale, the transferred funds, the downgraded care, the visitor log with his own name struck out, his mother's own words from her hospital bed about telling staff to call him, about never having agreed to any of it. He read from Priya's account of Eleanor's repeated, logged requests to contact her son, requests that had simply gone nowhere because policy required routing them through the very man who benefited from them being ignored. A few guests began quietly recording on their phones by this point, the way rooms do now when something is visibly, undeniably going wrong in real time. And Danny noticed one older woman near the front, someone he didn't recognize, pressing a hand to her chest with an expression that looked less like shock and more like recognition, as though she'd seen some version of this story unfold in her own family and had never had the chance to say so out loud. Preston's composure held for almost the entire account, the practiced calm of a man used to controlling every room he walked into, right up until Danny read aloud the exact dollar figure that had moved from the house sale into Preston's business account, a number specific enough, documented enough, that no amount of charm could soften it in front of a room full of donors who understood exactly what that kind of precision meant. Something in his face finally gave way then, not quite a confession, but the particular blankness of a man watching every carefully maintained version of himself collapse in real time in front of the exact community he'd spent years cultivating. Preston's wife, Miranda, who had been seated near the front table throughout the speech, rose partway from her chair as though to intervene, then seemed to think better of it, sinking back down with an expression Danny couldn't quite read, somewhere between loyalty and dawning horror at numbers she may well have never seen herself. Someone near the back called for hotel security, uncertain what else to do with a scene that had stopped being a family argument and become something closer to a live indictment. But by the time two uniformed staff members made their way through the crowd, Preston had already turned and walked out through a side door near the stage, leaving the podium, the microphone, and the unfinished silent auction behind him, along with any remaining shred of the reputation he'd spent 6 years building one gala at a time. Adult Protective Services, already midway through their formal investigation, moved considerably faster once the gala's very public unraveling reached local news outlets the following morning, several attendees having quietly recorded portions of the confrontation on their phones. Preston was formally charged within the month with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and the ensuing case, built substantially on the documentation Danny, Vicky, and Carla Fenn had assembled beforehand, resulted in a plea agreement requiring full restitution of the diverted funds, along with a permanent legal prohibition from ever again holding power of attorney or fiduciary responsibility over another person's assets. The house itself, it turned out, could not be recovered, having already passed to new owners who'd purchased it in good faith, but the proceeds from its sale, along with the additional funds Preston had drawn down over those 8 months, were ordered returned to Eleanor's estate in full. The fallout extended well beyond the courtroom. Preston's own business, a mid-sized insurance brokerage he'd built his local reputation on, saw a slow but steady exodus of clients over the following months, word having spread through exactly the kind of tight-knit business community that had once made his charity gala such a reliable networking success. Miranda filed for a legal separation 4 months after the gala, taking their 2 teenage children with her to her sister's house across the state line, a move Danny heard about secondhand through Vicky and felt, to his own quiet surprise, no satisfaction over at all, only a kind of tired sadness at how far the damage had rippled out from one man's decision to treat their mother's dwindling estate as his own private resource. Eleanor Calloway's recovery, once she was moved to a genuinely well-run facility Carla helped Danny and Vicky select together, was slow but real. The dehydration and infection that had brought Danny to her bedside that first terrible night resolved within weeks under proper care. And while her memory remained unpredictable, prone to the same gaps and confusions that had settled in gradually over recent years, her lucid stretches grew steadier and more frequent once regular visits, real conversation, and genuine attention returned to her days. Danny visited every week without fail, sometimes finding her sharp and present, recognizing him instantly and asking after his business with real interest. Other days finding her confused about the year or the season, but never again finding her alone in the way that first phone call had described. The new facility staff, once they understood the full history, went out of their way to make sure Eleanor's stated wishes were logged directly and reviewed independently rather than filtered through any single family contact, a policy change Carla had specifically negotiated as part of the transition. Danny found something quietly healing in watching a nurse there, a patient older woman named Dolores, sit with his mother during a difficult afternoon and simply ask her, directly, who she wanted to see and when, writing the answer down herself rather than waiting on anyone else's permission to act on it. If you'd spent 3 years believing you weren't wanted somewhere you desperately wanted to be, and then found out the truth was the opposite of everything you'd been told, would you have been able to forgive the family member who let you believe it? Or would that particular kind of stolen time be the one thing you couldn't get back, no matter what came afterward? Danny never fully answered that question for himself, not in any clean final way. He and Preston did not reconcile, not in any meaningful sense, though the legal process eventually forced a kind of formal, distant civility between them at family gatherings that neither pretended was anything warmer than obligation. Vicky, though, became someone Danny leaned on in a way he hadn't since they were kids. The two of them splitting visits to their mother, coordinating her care, slowly rebuilding something between themselves that Preston's years of controlled information had quietly prevented. Eleanor herself, in one of her clearest afternoons about 4 months after that terrible 2 a.m. phone call, took Danny's hand across a small table in the facility's sunroom and told him, with a directness her illness sometimes stripped away and sometimes sharpened, that she'd spent months of confused, foggy days believing her own son had abandoned her, and that no part of getting her memory back had hurt worse than realizing how wrong that belief had been and how long it had been allowed to stand. "I never stopped asking for you, Danny," she said. "I just stopped being able to make anyone listen." He told her he knew that now, and that he wasn't going anywhere again. And for the first time since that 2 a.m. phone call had torn his careful, guarded life back open, Danny let himself believe that the years he'd lost weren't the only years that were going to count. She asked him, that same afternoon, whether he could bring her some of the photographs from the old house, the ones she remembered sitting in a box on the top shelf of the hall closet, and Danny had to explain, gently, that the house itself was gone now, sold without her knowledge or agreement, and that he didn't yet know what had happened to the boxes inside it. Her face fell for a moment, then steadied, the way it seemed to do more and more as her strength returned. "Then we'll make new ones," she said simply, and squeezed his hand again. Danny spent that evening in the parking lot of the facility before he'd even started his car, letting himself cry in a way he hadn't allowed since the divorce. Not from grief exactly, but from the strange, disorienting relief of finally being believed by the one person whose belief he'd needed most. Over the following months, Danny and his mother did make new photographs, small ones, taken on his phone during weekly visits, a slowly growing collection of ordinary afternoons that neither of them treated as ordinary at all. She met his daughter's new baby for the first time in one of those photographs, held steady in her arms despite the mild shake that had crept into her hands over the past year. Her face lit up with a clarity that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with simply being present for something good. Vicky started joining those visits too, on alternating weeks, and slowly the three of them built something that looked, from the outside, almost like an ordinary family, again, minus the one person who'd spent years quietly making sure it never could be. The story that ran through the local paper, and eventually, further afield once the gala video found its way online, focused mostly on the financial exploitation charges and the surprising fall of a well-regarded local philanthropist. But the part of the story that actually mattered, the part Danny thought about most on the long drives home from his weekly visits, wasn't about the money at all, though the money certainly mattered to his mother's remaining years of comfort. It was about how easily a family can be reshaped by whoever controls the flow of information inside it, how a lie repeated calmly and consistently for 3 years can feel indistinguishable from the truth to the person living inside it, and how the people we love most can be made to disappear from our lives. Not through any dramatic betrayal we'd recognize immediately, but through a series of small, reasonable-sounding excuses that add up, slowly, to an absence nobody quite chose on purpose. And that's the lesson worth sitting with from this one. If someone in your life controls every version of the story you're allowed to hear about someone you love, that arrangement deserves scrutiny long before a 2 a.m. phone call forces the question. The people who most benefit from your distance from someone are not always the people protecting that person's peace. Sometimes they're the ones who most need you to stay away. If this story reached something in you, subscribe and turn on that notification bell, because this channel is built on exactly these kinds of reckonings, and there's always another one waiting.